Today's topic is going to be using Pipeline to store HR files for agents and employees, as you can see here on the screen. And really, it's really just looking at how you can use Pipeline to keep track of agent or employee files, like 1099s or contract files, as well as store information there relevant to the agents or admins, and then also trigger reminders about important dates like license expirations or anniversary start dates, birthdays, etc. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive on in. I'm going to hop over to Pipeline. And first, I want to just kind of give you an overview of how it works so that you know, as we dive into each of these components, kind of how they all fit together. So basically, the way that you store HR information in Pipeline really utilizes its existing infrastructure, mostly how everything revolves around transactions. So you would basically create a transaction for each agent or admin, and I'm going to use agent going forward, even though you can do this for employees as well, for ease of communicating this. But so when you're creating, let's say, an HR file for an agent, you create a transaction, and then all of the different components within Pipeline sort of help to fit around it and secure and make it all much more convenient than you would storing it otherwise. Okay, so that's just kind of the overview and how transactions are central to how this is all set up. Okay, so let's hop over to our admin area so we can set up the components for it. So we'll go to our name in the upper right corner and then admin settings. And the first thing I want to show you how to set up is your transaction statuses. And what you do basically is create a custom HR transaction status. And you can name it whatever is appropriate, HR-admin only, or maybe admin use only, whatever makes sense for your office. So that when people see it, if they see it, that it'll be clear that this is for admin use only and it's for HR, okay? Now, when you create the status, you want to put it in the fell through category for a few reasons. One is that you probably already know that these bottom three categories here, status categories, closed, fell through, and auto expiry, those three categories automatically get backed up whenever a transaction gets that status. So if a transaction gets a closed status or a fell through status, that tells the system, hey, during the next backup, back up this transaction. So by putting your HR status into the fell through category, that triggers the system to back it up, okay? Also, the way that the backup system works generally is that if something gets backed up, again, let's say it goes into a fell through status and the system says, okay, I'm going to back you up at the next backup at the beginning of the month. Let's say later down the road, a few months later, you add a document to that transaction. The backup process is that if a transaction has been backed up and a document gets added after the backup, it'll get backed up again automatically. Okay, so by putting it in this fell through status, that ensures that it'll get backed up during the next backup, basically the first time that you enter it, as well as every time you add new docs. All right. Now, the reason we recommend putting it into the fell through category, not one of these others, is not into expiry because that just doesn't make sense, and not into close because that way it doesn't mess with your numbers when you're running reports based on transactions that have closed. Okay, so it doesn't fetter that whole your data in those scenarios when you want to get some clean data about closed transactions. Okay. Okay, so easy peasy, just go ahead and set up that HR transaction status there. Then under locations, you want to add a location that's specific for HR, okay? And it's simple, I've done it here, right? Just add location, type in whatever you're going to name it. In this case, we did HR-admin. And it's important to set this location up, a separate location up for the purpose that we talked about before, which is to keep your data clean. So if you're running a report based on, let's say, closed transactions by location or just transactions in general by location, you don't want these HR transactions showing up in that report or in that list. Okay. Okay, so that is adding a location, special HR location. For transaction labels, you only need to create a custom HR transaction label if one, you use transaction labels. If you don't use transaction labels, obviously you wouldn't need to create one. Of course, we strongly recommend that you use transaction labels because they are massively powerful. And if you've got any questions about that, let us know, or take a look at our previous webinar about using transaction labels. But again, if you use transaction labels and if you require them to be entered on transactions, meaning that a label must be selected when a transaction is created, then you want to create an HR label here as well. That way, when the transaction is created and they are being forced to add select a transaction label, it's one that's appropriate for HR. Okay. And again, having a special HR1 ensures that your data, when you're running a report for all condos or all commercial, isn't impacted by having any HR transactions in there. Okay. And let me just real quick show you, since I mentioned, I'm going to open admin in a separate tab here. Since I mentioned being able to require the transaction label to be entered on transactions, this is where you do that, require transaction label. So you can toggle that on and off. Okay. Okay. So now we've set up those three components, the labels, the locations, and the statuses. So now we're ready to add a transaction, an HR related transaction. So let me go ahead and click add transaction. I'm going to go ahead and give it my HR location. I'm going to name it, let's say, Joe Agent. Where's HR file? Okay. I don't need an MLS number, obviously. I'll give it my HR status and my HR label. If you don't require labels, you don't have to specify an HR one. People can just leave it blank if it's not appropriate, or you could still use it even if it's not required, just to make it cleaner. Okay, obviously I don't need a close date or much of this other information. Namely, what I'm doing now is storing any information that's specific to this agent here. Now, keep in mind that you're already storing some agent-specific information under Manage Users, and that's perfectly fine. You don't need to replicate it over here necessarily, except for two exceptions. One is maybe the way that you're using these HR transaction files means that you need to access some bit of information about the agent regularly. Maybe their license number or something, and you want to put that here because whenever you're going through your workflow and looking at these transactions, you need to know that information, or whatever bit of information you want to go ahead and duplicate over here because it's more convenient. Okay, so for convenience, that could be one reason that you copy this information over here as well. And then the second reason is for triggering something to happen. For example, let's say their license expiration date or their start date anniversary. You want to remember those and get reminded about those for some reason. Okay, and we're not going to put that actually here in the more info field or in the admin info field, which is where you would put this extra information about them. We're going to put it after I save this, but I just wanted to mention that that's the second reason you could replicate some information over here. Okay, but for now, again, I've just put something that is really not date or trigger related, maybe some license number. Okay, right? So it's really just those bits of information to get this transaction created, add the transaction, and so now I've got an HR file for Joe Agent, right? And notice I had my checklists set up to be automatically assigned. So I've really, whenever I create an HR file like this, I've got all my information that I need on this in my checklist here. Remember a moment ago I mentioned that I may want to trigger some reminders about dates, maybe again the agent's start date anniversary, or maybe like we see here their license expiration date. In some states, the real estate governing body requires that you monitor an agent's or review an agent's docs for 2 years up until their 2-year anniversary. So different reasons you could want to be reminded about certain dates, including their birthday, right? And so I've got this checklist that was automatically added. Now I can edit it. So now I can maybe go ahead and add their license expiration date. Maybe 2019, right? And so I've got that, and I'll go ahead and give it an expiration date of, what did I say, 12, I don't remember what I said, 12/1, okay. Okay, so now I'll get my reminder about this license expiration date for this person so it doesn't slip through. Okay, so super nice to have this automatically added so that I can just go ahead and edit those dates, and then I'm getting my automatic reminders. I can also have my checklist items for different documents that I want to upload, HR documents for this for the agent, 1099s, independent contractor agreements, etc. Right? So basically that allows me to store information that I want to store up here. I can store, go ahead and upload docs, these docs in particular, or any other docs that are HR docs related to this person that I want to upload. So I've got the infrastructure that already exists on transactions to help support making this super convenient and also super secure, right? And then speaking of security, I've got other features of Pipeline that help do that as well. On my checklists, I've got the security there, so I can set visibility. So if I wanted, let's say, maybe I wanted the, actually, let me back up for a second. Let me first talk about getting the agent to view this information in general, because then the rest will make sense after I mention that. So I've got my HR file for Joe agent here. I could want Joe to have access to this transaction so that he can see this information. If so, I would use the structure that already exists for Pipeline and add them as an agent. So let's say I've got Joe on this transaction. I want him to be able to see this transaction, but I don't want him to be able to see certain tasks on the transaction. So for that, I can actually set certain tasks to only be visible to admins. Maybe the birthday. I didn't want him to be surprised. I don't want him to know that I'm going to remember his birthday, so I can set visibility so only the admins can see that, right? And maybe for the anniversary start date, that's fine for everyone to see, meaning him, listing agents, or everyone or whoever, right? Okay. And then same for the docs. If I'm going to upload, let's say some, well, these aren't really HR docs, but if I'm going to upload this agent's docs, I can set the permission category to be visible to the listing agents, or if it's a private doc, I can say that it's private, or that it's only for office staff, etc. Okay. So again, just utilizing the built-in securities that already exist within Pipeline to secure this and make it super easy and really just obvious and intuitive as far as what's going on. Okay, and so the last thing I want, two last things. One is some offices do not want to, when they're having transactions added, do not want these statuses to show up, these HR specific statuses. They just want it to be completely hidden. In that case, what you can do is once you've added the HR transactions for the agents, go back into admin and for the statuses as well as the labels, you can deactivate those. Okay. By deactivating them, that means when you're adding a transaction or looking at a transaction, they will no longer show up in the list to select, but those transactions that used it will still keep them, and you can search by them, etc. Okay. Then if you need to add a new HR transaction, you can temporarily turn it on so that you can add it and then turn it back off. Okay, so that's feasible when you're not adding agents too often, which is normally the case. You're not usually in and out regularly adding and removing agents. But if you are doing it regularly, we recommend using the method that we talked about at the beginning, which is to just maybe append admin only or something that made it clear that agents should not utilize that for regular statusing or regular labeling, etc. Okay. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is just how to search for these. When you are on your transactions page and you need to find those HR docs, obviously you can always use your global search no matter what page you're on. And let's say I'm looking for Joe Agent's HR file, I can just use his name, but you can also filter and then look for, let's say, all of my HR docs and filter, or I can even look by label and filter that way, right? Okay, so you've got options there. Okay, and so that is it for for how to use Pipeline to store your HR.